Congratulations! If you've made it this far, that means that you've gone through all of Lesson 0, which goes over what this course is about and how it should be used, and Lesson 1, which explores the basics of mark making, ellipses, and perspective, and that you've done so on the website page by page, going through the written material and watching the videos as they come up. It also means that you've completed all of your Lesson 1 homework to put the concepts from the lectures into practice and establish some practical understanding, which will be further developed by continuing in your warm-ups, and have received feedback on it through either our free community feedback options or our paid official critique program. Now you're at the part of the course that gave it its name, the 250 box challenge. The challenge, which we'll explain the gist of in this video and expand upon in the next few, is very daunting for beginners and understandably so. Those of you who are more familiar with the nature of assignments given in art school will probably find it to be less daunting, but regardless, drawing 250 boxes right out the gate is a lot. It's one of the things we get a lot of criticism for in terms of dumping students in the deep end of the pool, but I assure you, it serves an important purpose. It is also very important that you remember that this course as a whole and all it asks must be balanced out with drawing done for the sake of drawing. That is, our glorious 50% rule. If you've been following it as you should be, you'll have a fair bit of drawing for the hell of it under your belt. When we start out, the 50% rule can be really harrowing and torturous, and we are constantly faced with our limitations, with the unreasonableness of our own expectations. But with time, those fears fade into the back of our minds and give way to the ability to relax a little, to draw without needing to turn out well, to stop thinking in terms of what you can and cannot do, to be like the Joker in The Dark Knight and simply chase cars, unconcerned with what you'd do if you ever actually caught one. That's going to be important in getting through this challenge, so I hope you've kept to the rule. If you haven't, you may want to take some time to balance those scales before moving forward. So, what is the 250 box challenge? Well, it's a lot more than just drawing 250 boxes, but that is what it is at its core. We draw 250 freely and randomly rotated boxes, meaning not aligned to any particular direction, so no infinite vanishing points, all the while estimating the convergences of our edges to the best of our ability. We combine this with checking our work with analytical strategies to identify where our approach can be adjusted and improved. Some might consider this grinding, but by our definition, it is not. Grinding is what occurs when we perform a repetitive task and rely on our own judgment to decide whether or not we are finished. This challenge has a specific finish line, a quantity associated with it, and whether or not we've done it correctly is determined by the third party that gives us our feedback. It is only grinding when we ourselves have the freedom to come back around and say, no, I can do this better. This feeds into a cycle of aimless repetition, driven not by the experience or the understanding of someone who already knows what should be given priority and what may not be really as critical as it can seem to a beginner, but rather how we feel about ourselves and about our work. A beginner's greatest enemy is their own expectations of what they should be able to achieve at any given point, which is entirely divorced from the reality of what is reasonable. After all, why would a beginner already be armed with that understanding? Getting back on track, let's take a moment to discuss why we're subjecting ourselves to a challenge like this. In applying strategies like the Y method from organic perspective and the line extensions from rough perspective, we will gradually develop our intuitive understanding of 3D space in a variety of areas. That isn't to say that we're going to come out the other side having mastered this skill. It's only 250 boxes after all, and is a drop in the bucket compared to everything else you'll be doing across your studies. But you can think of it as a sort of strategic boot camp that is going to kick you forward by some measure and help set you up for what we face next. The biggest among the areas this exercise works upon, and the core goal of the exercise as a whole, is to develop our ability to judge convergences. That is, given a set of edges that are parallel in 3D space, and therefore converging when drawn on a flat page as lines, We want to be able to intuitively understand how to add more lines to that set such that they all converge consistently. In 3D space, that means adding more edges that are parallel, and in the 2D space of the page, it means adding lines that converge as closely as we can manage to the same vanishing point of those lines that are already present. Other notable impacts the box challenge is designed to have is to demonstrate how every complex task is ultimately a series of simple tasks. The challenge is made up of 250 individual boxes. Each box is made up of 12 edges, and each line we draw has us working through 3 phases of the ghosting method. In working through this challenge, we will show ourselves that the seemingly insurmountable can be overcome. And through that very demonstration, we develop the discipline to see it through. Not by rushing, not by altering the nature of the task, but by chipping away at it bit by bit. Everyone works at a different pace. Some people will be able to squeeze in 10 boxes a day and get it done in a little under a month. But some have families, children, responsibilities, a full-time job, and can only do a single box per day. It makes no difference, and it does not matter how long it all takes. What matters is that it can be done one step at a time, and that you have it in you to do the best of your current ability, which is both the most and the least we can ask of you. Continuing on, it's important that you remember that this is an exercise. The focus is not on drawing good boxes. That is a side effect. For example, it is very common for students to get so hung up on whether or not the back corner of their box is positioned correctly that they hyper-focus on it. The back corner is a distraction, a red herring. It does not control the outcome, it is the outcome. If you recall from Lesson 1's plotted perspective exercise, we would frequently end up with back edges that would not run perfectly vertically, but rather slant in one way or another when we drew it by connecting the back 2 corners. This was the result of all the little discrepancies that built up over time. Every slight misalignment or barely incorrect positioning of the ruler when plotting back to the vanishing points, things you might not even be able to see with your naked eye, will cause tiny errors to accumulate, and we'd only really see their result in that back edge. It's the same thing here. Every little misalignment in our estimation of each line's orientation, every mistake in getting them to converge consistently to the vanishing point all those lines of a given set share, the more our back corner's going to come out wonky. In order to direct our attention away from distractions like the back corner and focus entirely on the source of these issues, we leverage line extensions, very much like those introduced in the rough perspective exercise. There we only had one concrete vanishing point to deal with, and so we extended each of those lines back in space to see how our lines were behaving relative to the one vanishing point we'd marked out. This would help us to see where we tended to make mistakes so we could reflect upon what might be causing them, what we should be taking into consideration in our approach, and applying those adjustments in our next set, gradually improving with every attempt. There are a few differences here, but the premise is the same. We now have 3 concrete vanishing points for each box, so we're extending 3 full sets of lines. For the bulk of the challenge, we also won't have explicit vanishing points marked on the page. So instead of gauging how close or far we are from a set point, we'll be looking more at whether our lines tend to converge consistently towards the same arbitrary point, or if they tend to be more scattered. We've talked about what this exercise is for and some things to keep in mind. As to the assignment itself, I'll give you a brief overview here, but we're going to be going into more detail on how the task should be approached in the next couple videos. As a whole, we're drawing 250 boxes, keeping to about 5 or 6 to a page, assuming you're working on standard A4 or 8.5-inch by 11-inch printer paper as recommended in Lesson 0, to ensure that they're drawn at a big enough size. The exercise itself, however, is going to be divided into 3 sections: the first 50, the next 50, and the remaining 150. The first 50 will have us plotting our vanishing points directly on the page and ghosting back to them, similarly to the rough perspective exercise. This is to get us accustomed to the general mechanics of what we're doing in this exercise and ensuring that we start out on the right foot, focusing on the convergence of our lines, which can become a little easier to forget about as those vanishing points are pushed farther away. The next 50 will force our vanishing points much farther off the page, which also means we won't be able to plot them out, but rather we'll have to estimate where they are by looking at the other lines we have drawn thus far and examining how they behave. This is more similar to what we were doing in the organic perspective exercise. And finally, the last 150 boxes we draw will be a mixture of those with vanishing points close up to the box itself to give us dramatic foreshortening, as well as those with vanishing points very far away to give us shallower foreshortening. We will not be drawing the vanishing points on the page for any of these, so we're still going to have to estimate our line's orientations based on those that are already present. That's just a basic overview. You're still absolutely going to need to go through the next video, which gets into more detail about how we will be tackling the first 50 before you start out on your work. As with all of our videos, as well as our written material, it is important that you watch and read them carefully, take notes as needed, and expect to go through them now and again as you continue the challenge. After all, you would not want to find that you completed all 250 boxes only to discover that instructions that were laid out here were ignored or skipped. It happens more than you'd expect.